All right, so let's get started, Chevra. So this is a new tshuva. See, we've seen something like it before. Uh, Again, we're dealing with the issue of mekach tos. So mekach tos is, I claim, the thing that I bought is not what was promised to me. Just like the previous tshuva, where the guy was purchasing something that he thought was a higher standard of kashrus when it was a lower standard. So this is about Tainus mekach tos mikablan sheivtiach limkor ledatiyim bilvad. The claim of mekach tos an invalid or a sale under false pretenses, I guess would be the way to explain it, from a contractor who promised that this building was or this neighborhood was only going to be sold to datiyim, to religious people. And then all of a sudden I discover, to my horror, that there are people who are not religious that I'm living next to. Oh my gosh, this is the worst possible thing that I could have anticipated in my life. Now, for us, of course, we don't realize that this is traumatic to a person who wants to live in a completely hermetically sealed community that is not has no exposure to non-religious people. So let's take a look at the shaila. Kaniti dira mechevrat b'niyah. I bought a dira from a contracting company. And they told me that this building is being sold just to dati people. And after occupancy, we noticed that there are people, horror of horrors, there are people in the neighborhood, there are people walking around without yarmulkes. And they bring televisions into their homes. Rahmana litzlan, may God save us from this horror. Ha'im zechutenu lidrosh pitzui me'achevra al pi din Torah. Do we have a right for a refund or some kind of financial compensation from the contractors who sold us the property under false pretenses, false representation? Any parallel in secular law to something like this?
Right. I was thinking. Contract, the clause that's offensive to him might be illegal anyway.
Well, it's interesting. Over here, it just says they told me. It doesn't say that it was represented in writing. Yeah.
Seniors communities.
Kind of buildings that are something only. Well, it's interesting because there is an exception in the Human Rights Code probably about like old age places, right? So that's discriminatory against young people. Like adult only apartments.
But what about a seniors community?
Yeah, that's what Marvin just said. What about no pets?
No children.
There are no
pets. And no children. No pets, no children, no irreligious Jews. Okay. All right. Let's take a look. Yeah. Right. All right. So Din So the tshuva that Rav Sharaga presents to us is as follows. He says, Din talui b'she'ela mahi hahagdara shel adam dati. So first we have to define what is a religious Jew. What does it mean to be dati? That's right. Does it mean that I wear a kippah all the time? Does it mean that I don't have a television in my house? And then the second question we have to ask is, was the misrepresentation, did it rise to the level of nullifying the sale? So those are the two issues. Vihine. בהגדרה של אדם דתי, ישנם אנשים המחשיבים שכל מי ששומר שבס ואוכל כשר כאדם דתי. So, as far as defining what a religious Jew is, there are people who say that if someone is shomer Shabbos and eats kosher, like any other religious Jew, afilu im hu machzik beveito televizia o internet hu machshirim lo ksherim, then he's still called dati, even though he has a television and internet in his house. Okay? Umitzad sheni, and other technology, he says that's not kosher. Umitzad sheni, yesh anashim hamivinim kedavar hapashut, she'adam dati hu davka mi shemishtadel lishmor et kol pratei hadat deoraisa uderabana. On the other hand, there are people who will tell you that that's not the definition of dati. Dati means, I just saw a comedian last night on a clip. It's an old joke, but he sort of took it for himself. He said, I define myself as modern Orthodox. And I just realized what the word modern means. Not so. Right? Right? So he says, I wish. So he added, he said, because people pick and choose what they want to observe. He said, I wish there was a way to explain this in other areas of life. So you went out with the girl. He said, yes, she's smart. She's professional. Well, how does she look? She's modern pretty. Anyway, so therefore, there's another definition of dati, which is only someone who makes every attempt to observe every single aspect of the religion, whether it's deoraisa or derabbanan. And by the way, that's an interesting contrast. I didn't know that having a television in your house is someone who doesn't try that hard to observe every aspect of deoraisa or derabbanan. What if a person has a television in his house and he uses it responsibly to watch sports events and news? Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And if he has the internet, yeah, right, exactly. All right.
Gittel Torah,
Okay.
Gittel Torah.
Okay. Thank you, Izzy. Izzy's the Haredi from the background. He's so frum he won't even come to the bayit. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So because of Hagrash Vazner Zatzal, so Rav Vazner Zatzal wrote, Imisha over bizadon of the shot nefesh al davar echad bein miyadi oraisa bein midarabanan, that anyone who deliberately violates even one deoraisa or derabanan law, knowing that what he's doing is wrong, but he does it anyway, Adam kazeh nikra poirek hadat me alav. Such a person has cast off religiosity from himself. V'chol ma shemechanim hayom b'chaye hayom yom anashim krovim lachug hadatiyim kedatiyim zehu ziyuf gamur. And if anyone who tries to label such people as dati, knowing that they are deliberately disregarding one aspect of halacha, that is an absolute falsehood. It's an absolute falsehood. What about a person who's very, very frum and doesn't have a television in their house, but cheats on their income tax? Yeah. So is that dati? Yeah, so
They only look dati.
okay. That's right. That's right. So if we take a look at the footnote, he says, "Kain kosav b'shut shevet halevi ki davar pashut shemi ikar din Torah lo nikra shomer hadat elamishu mishtadel be'emes lishmor kol pratei hadat deoraita uderabana." He says that's what Rav Vazner writes in Shevet Halevi. He says a person is called an observer of the faith only if he truly tries to observe every aspect of the religion, both midioraisa and derabbanan. Ela shebinidon didan srichim lada'at ma hevin hamocher belashon datiyim uma hevin hakoneh. But in our situation, we have to still define what was each party understanding when the communication was that this is for datiyim, for religious Jews only. So Rav Osner also addresses what Rav Sharaga is talking about, but he says you have to understand what people were intending, what their intention was when they communicated it. Just because I might define, Rav Osner has defined the word dati as a person who is totally from, through and through, without any cutting of corners. But when the contractor used the word dati, maybe he didn't mean it the same way that I, Rav Osner, mean it and define it. Bekavanato lomar da'afal pi dali b'de'emes halashon dati more dafka l'misha shomer Torah mitzvahs b'kol prateha b'kol makom b'inyanei tenai mushtaros u'chedom holchin machar kavanat ela shekatvu kain v'lo achar lashon hakatuv mamash. He says that even though the word dati in its correct definition, in its technically correct definition, is someone who is totally, but you don't use technical definitions when you're discussing transactional language. In other words, if a person can sometimes use that word to mean something slightly different, you can't nullify a sale based on the fact that, well, the technical definition is not what you said. That's not the strict definition. And I'm sure that exists in secular law as well.
Has to be a meeting of the minds.
Yeah.
Not subjective, object by the court, by the surrounding circumstances.
Right.
One or the other or ambiguous.
Exactly.
But
Okay.
when there's not a meeting of minds, does that then nullify the agreement? Which is what they're trying to do. Like I said, that's what these complainants are trying to do, is upturn this based on saying that there wasn't a contract, because we didn't understand the terms. Oh, okay. Right.
Then we have to put a condition into a contract. Then we have to give two parts to the condition. If the condition is met, I'll do this, and if the condition is not met, then this will happen.
Generally speaking, yes. That's what the Gemara in Kedushin says. We learn that from Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, but that's that's a technical issue having to do with conditional transactions. Yeah, it is. Okay, fine. So maybe it was doubled, or maybe when we go according to secular Dina de Malchusa Dina, if the government doesn't require that because it's implicit, maybe that law doesn't apply today. Okay, but in any event, he says this is the language of the Shulchan Aruch. Yesh misha omer shetanai she'adam matne im chaveiro ein holchim achar lashon hakatuv ela achar hakavana. Really, Rav Osner is quoting the Shulchan Aruch because the Shulchan Aruch says that when there's a condition in a transaction, you don't go according to the technical language, but you go according to the intent. The Afal Pisha Katav Maran Din Zeh B'Shem Yesh Misha Omer Mikol Mokom Svir LeKavate Mima Shehiviu B'Veit Yosef B'Shtika V'Lo Hevi Shum Cholek Al Zeh. And even though the Shulchan Aruch, when he writes, it says Yesh Misha Omer, there is an opinion that states this, but that's how we paskin, because when we look at the earlier composition of the Mechaber called the Beis Yosef, we see that he doesn't bring it down with any conflicting opinion. וכן עין בשמה שכוסף בכל מקום שמרן מצא דין שאינו נזכר גם כן בשאר פוסקים כתב עליו ויש מי שאומר וסביר לשכן ההלכה. Why then does the Shulchan Aruch sometimes say Yesh Misha Omer when no one seems to disagree with that halacha? The answer is because it's a signal that the Machaber, the Shulchan Aruch, couldn't find anyone else who says this, but he's saying it based on logic. So therefore, he says Yesh Misha Omer. There is an opinion like this. It doesn't mean that he's suggesting that you don't have to follow it, but what he is suggesting is that this is based on what's logical, and I can't prove it from a whole litany of other sources. We find this in many places. Mishpat, Ayin Sham. Okay, so that's the background for this. So apparently Rav Vosner had dealt with this tshuva as well. But according to that, Hadavar Talui Efo Haita Habiniya. So based on that, we really have to look at the context more carefully. Where did the Construction take place? If the building was taking place in a Haredi area, let's say in Bnei Brak, okay, or in Beitar, is it Beitar or Beitar Elite? I don't remember. Or in Kiryat Malachi, or in those kinds of areas, Mashma'uto shel dati, hainu adam shemishtadel lishmor. So the definition of a dati in that context is a person who attempts to observe et kol pratei halachot in kol, together, all the halachas, together with all of hamishtamei mikach, and everything that is implied in being a charedi. Aval ima b'niyah hayta be'ezorim chilonim, but if it was the contract was presented in an area which is already not considered a religious Haredi neighborhood, so sham dati hamashmauti, so sham dati hamashmauti, shuhu shomer Shabbos v'holech lihitpalel. So that in that context, if you're selling a building in Tel Aviv or in Netanya, then the context is that this building is religious, means people are shomer Shabbos, right? And they go to shul. They go to shul every day. Ve'afal pishu machzik machshirim tmeim beveito uchedome unachshav be'enei abriot ke'adam dati. And even though he may have in his house things that aren't kosher, he may have things that other people would consider to be treif in the, well, it's whether it's a television or Wi-Fi or I don't know, smartphones or other things like that. But he's considered dati in that context. So you also have to look at the way that the building is constructed. In other words, take a look. How is the apartment built? If it's built with only one sink that serves for both milchiks and fleishiks in the kitchen, okay, in other words, so that's an indication that, when you go into the purchase of a piece of real estate, you got to keep your eyes open. What was it designed for? For whom was it designed? If it was designed with, let's say, a big living room and a small dining room and one sink to serve for both milchiks and fleishiks, so you know that it was designed for a certain lifestyle, which may be more modern than you feel comfortable with. Oh, is that right? Yeah. Yeah. And let's say the mirpeset, the balcony, doesn't allow for the placement of a sukkah because it's, let's say, underneath the other balcony above it. So it shows that it was designed for traditional Jews, but not Haredi Jews. And really, a very important rule in all of this is what we should look at based on the text of the Rambam in Hilchos Mechira, the laws of sales and transactions. He writes, "V'zeh ikar gadol b'chol divrei masa umatan." The Rambam writes that this is a very important general rule in laws of purchases and sales. Holchim achar lashon b'nei adam ba'oto makom va'achar haminhag v'chulei ad kan lashana. Everything depends on the local convention when a transaction is made. Okay, the lachein tzarich lirot ma mivinim ha'anashim. And therefore, you have to see what do people understand? When the company says that they're selling the apartment just to datiyim, to religious Jews, you have to look at the context, look at the local convention of how you think that these builders understand datiyim. B'chol safek b'ferush shel dati tzarich lekayem et hapachot shebemashmaut. And any kind of doubt, if there's any ambiguity, as long as they fulfill the minimal definition of dati, so then they're not in breach of contract. Aval im machar dira la'anashim shebarur lakol shehem ovrim al isrim b'shat nefesh uvizadon. But if an apartment in that building was sold to people who are clearly not religious, they violate the law, they're machalol Shabbos. Nimsa diyesh kan mekachtos tahavi kemi shemachal lo yain v'nimsa chaymetz. Then, if it's outside the pale of any definition of a religious Jew, because the person, is playing the TV loudly on Shabbos, right? And they go to the beach on Shabbos, and they have wild parties on Yom Kippur, and all of these other things, right? So then you know that this person cannot be in any way represented as a dati, as a religious Jew. So then there is a mekachtos. If I bought an apartment there under the understanding that the neighbors were going to be abiding by some minimal level of religiosity, because that's no different from a person who was told he was buying wine and got a delivery of vinegar, right? It's two different things. The kol shekain imhu sholeach et yiladav lebatei sefer chiloniyim v'yesh chashash ha'yiladim shelo yilmadu mima'aseim. And this is certainly true when you're dealing with a younger family who have small children. And the whole objective of this guy moving into this building is that he wanted his kids to mingle with other Shomer Shabbos kids. And it turns out that the building now is occupied by a lot of children who go to secular schools. And I'm concerned that my children are going to be influenced by these other kids. Rambam. And the Rambam writes, Shederach b'riyato shel adam liot nimshach b'deotav u'v'ma'asav acharei ava chaverav v'nohei keminagan. As the Rambam writes, that it's only human nature for people to be influenced by their surroundings and by the people in those surroundings. V'lachein omar hatana ba'avos harchek mishachein ra. That's why it says in Pirkei Avos, distance yourself from a bad neighbor. The yeladim ka'ilu yecholim lahashpia al hayeladim shel hashomrei Torah u'mitzvos. And certainly such children can have a negative influence on people who are religious or shomer Shabbos. V'lachein al hahorim lishmor et yaldehem mehem. And therefore, parents would be well advised to make sure that they are not integrated with families of have children who are not dati, because they have to be concerned that their children will be adversely influenced. Shema yilbendu mi ma'aseim haroim, because they may learn from the negative behaviors of those other children. So this is very much a part of Israeli society. Okay, I don't share the same worldview because of my life experiences, and I don't know. I'm sure we would probably get a mixed poll if we took a poll among the people in our community, but clearly this exists in some people's minds in our community as well. When my wife and I were raising our kids, they were the rabbi's children. So even when we lived in communities where there were very, very few Shomer Shabbos children, We succeeded in raising good kids. We sent them to schools which taught them about Judaism and about Torah and mitzvahs, and they saw a good example. They went to shul every Shabbos, and even though they had kids in their class who were not Shomer Shabbos, it didn't bother us because we knew that we felt confident that because we were doing God's work, so to speak, out in the certain Jewish outposts with smaller Jewish communities, then it was, that when we would be protected, and our kids would turn out okay. And thank God, for the most part, that's what happened. But there in Israeli society, that is not the ethic. There is this value that Rav Sharaga is reflecting upon, that from Jews should stay with from Jews. They shouldn't integrate into the larger society. I think that this attitude is not the sort of the verdict on this is not monolithic. And I think that there are Jews today, from Jews, who are moving to places like Tel Aviv and building up Garinim, building up small, communities that are building up Yiddishkeit and influencing Jews who are not religious. And yes, is it possible that some religious kids may be adversely affected? Yes. But think about the greater good of the Torah and mitzvahs that are being spread throughout Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is not the same place that it was even 10 years ago. Okay? Al Kain. And therefore, ba'ofen shemocher la'adam kazeh. So in a situation where the apartment was sold to such a person who is concerned about the influences of his surroundings, im nichtav hachozeh kidinei hatanoim al pi hahalacha, then, like Doug was making reference to, provided that the conditions stipulated in the contract were written in accordance with halacha, so then you could argue a void sale because the condition was not met. Aval b'makom shahadavar hu safek, im hakona nechshav la'adam dati ba'oto makom, but anywhere where there's an ambiguity as to what the definition of a religious Jew is, kol od shelo huvrar hadavar, as long as it's not clear as day what the definition of dati means, amotzi mechavero olav haraya. Then we have to resort back to the general principle of you've already occupied the apartment, you've paid for the apartment, and now you want to void the sale, then you have to bring the burden of proof is upon the person who wishes to extract money from the seller.
But the plans clearly showed that there was only one thing, and it was a small dining room and large living room. It obviously was not set up for that lifestyle. Could you still go back against that? I mean, is there a certain amount of buyer beware, or the buyer has to take a certain amount of responsibility?
The buyer could make the argument that I bought the apartment with the understanding that all the other occupants were going to be minimally dati. But I have a next door neighbor who has a party till midnight on Yom Kippur. And that's clearly not dati. So there is a misrepresentation. And I think Rav Sharaga is saying you would be able, and just because the apartment was not structured in the way that a Haredi family would want to live, but minimally dati, you would expect. So yes, you can take the seller to Beis Din. Yeah.
Section 1 of definition.
That's right.
So
Exactly.
you could say dati, the parties agree that dati means the following,
Yes.
and then you're good.
protect the buyers and if it's not, because now there's a definition.
Yeah, and as he says in footnote number Dalid, he says, like Doug had said, it has to be a Tanai couple. It has to be a double Tanai, which is Vehain Kodam Olav. You have to say the sale is valid if all of the residents are religious, and the sale is invalid if the not all of the residents are religious, and that's Paskind and Shulchan Aruch. Okay, I have to hold it here for today. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everybody. Peaceful and unobstructed.